Hello, bookworms. Welcome to The Best Book Ever, the podcast where I get to know interesting people by asking them about their favorite books. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and holy moly, do I have an interesting guest for you today. Lya Badgley was born in Southeast Asia, returned to Seattle to become a rock star. Do you know what? I'm going to let her tell you the rest. Hers is a life packed full of adventure. The book she chose to talk to me about today is set in Cambodia, a country that Lya knows really well. And it's an atmospheric thriller with hints of Hemingway and Patricia Highsmith. I know you're going to love hearing about why Hunters in the Dark by Lawrence Osborne is the best book ever. Hi, Lya. Welcome to the Best Book Ever podcast.
Thank you, Julie. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you. Lya, as we discussed in our early messages, I think you have led possibly the most interesting life of anyone I have ever met, which is a sort of a vague thing to say, but in your case, it's really true. As I read through your bio, every sentence was more interesting than the last. I was wondering, will you tell my listeners about, tell us about your entire life? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, do you have a couple of hours?
Well, since we are talking specifically about Southeast Asia today with this book, will you tell my listeners about all of your connections to Southeast Asia?
Yes, I'm happy to. I was born in a country called Burma, and it's now referred to as its original name as Myanmar, back in the 50s. And my father was there as an academic and doing research. And my mother was there as an artist. And she was 7 months pregnant and very brave to go to the other side of the world. They're from Montana and had me there. So that sort of started things. And then due to my father's background, special as a political scientist specializing in Southeast Asia, I returned back to Burma as an adult and discovered sort of a deep and profound connection that had been missing from my life. I've characterized it in the past as sort of, missing puzzle pieces that I didn't even know were missing. But when I walked off that plane and felt that hug of the humidity and the heat and the smells and the tastes and the sounds and the language and in my ear, because I grew up with that, and as a young child. So we lived there until I was, say, 4, and then we left, and then I hadn't returned, and then I did return, and it was like, this is what I've been missing. So in the meantime, between the time that while that was all happening, I was involved in the Seattle music scene and sort of the pre-grunge. People are familiar with that era of music in Seattle. And so right before that all exploded, I was doing music and put out an album and a video and blah, blah. And then I became very ill and was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And so that sort of shifted everything, and was, coping with that. The performing that I had been doing was curtailed. And so I really began to focus on writing words versus the music. And so it went from song lyrics to poetry to fiction. And that was sort of how that all happened. So as far as back to sort of the timeline and everything, then I was offered an opportunity to go with my then boyfriend in the early 90s to live in Cambodia. And at that point, I had returned to Burma once. And so I was kind of knew what I was getting into, but surprise, surprise, Cambodia and Burma are different countries. So I lived there for a year. I had this amazing opportunity to be the director of Cornell University's archival project at Tuol Museum of Genocide. That's a mouthful. Basically, what I did was oversaw a local staff, worked closely with them to microfilm the confessions that were, and other documents that were created under this horrific Khmer Rouge prison during the Khmer Rouge era. And so I learned a lot about things nobody should really know about, but needed to be documented for posterity. And subsequently, those documents were used in the crimes against humanity trials for some of the high-ranking Khmer Rouge leaders. So I did that, and after that, then I moved back to Burma and opened a restaurant. And so when one is an aspiring musician rock star, what does one do? But one works in a restaurant. So I had a lot of restaurant background, and so I took that with me to Burma. So I did that. Oh my God, where are we in this story? I'm just such a snoozer. So then met my now husband there, who was working as a diplomat for former Yugoslavia, and we married. And we were going to have a baby, and I was like, time to come back to Seattle area, and so did that. And anyway, now I have always been encouraged to consider writing my memoir, just because I've had this wild and crazy life. And I didn't go into all the details because seriously, we would be here a really long time. But so instead of doing that, I decided to pick up on the fiction that I had started way back when. So I have been writing novels.
How did you protect your heart in those years that you were doing the microfilm of the war crimes? Because you seem like such a gentle person. You seem very happy. Like there's a very, how did you protect the good in yourself when you were exposed to the absolute worst that we're capable of as a
well, Julie, how could I not be authentic and human in that environment? So I went there. It was the first project or sort of thing that I had done that wasn't just about me. I don't come from a religious background. I don't come from sort of a background of service. I say that with a big S, if that makes sort of any sense. I went as a self-occupied young woman, like many of us are, and so it was the first time that I had done anything that wasn't self-serving. And I don't mean that in a nasty way. I'm being completely honest here, right? So being there, people would come and ask me, how can I do this work? Exactly what you asked me, how can I do that? How can I go to my office every day, which was stained with blood on the floor? I mean, how could I look at these documents that were, someone's last words and extracted under horrible, conditions? So my answer to them was, how could I not do that? Because I had this opportunity to witness and to share my witnessing for civilization, for the future of civilization, of which, fingers crossed. So how could I not do that? So yeah, it messed with my head in a big way. And the book that I've just finished writing is it's not autobiographical, but it does draw on that experience to come to terms with it. Even though I did that, 30 years ago, it still is affecting who I am today. And so I wrote the novel to just sort of figure out, how do I feel about it, and how, what is evil? And I basically came to the conclusion that to to know evil, we just have to look in the darn mirror, because any human being is capable of evil under the right or wrong set of circumstances. And that was like this huge big thing for, my, silly little rock and roll girl that I was. And so that influences a lot of who I am. Definitely as a human being, and as a hopefully compassionate human being, and as a writer.
It's really fascinating to me that you went from that job to a restaurant, that you turned around, because I'm always interested in how food is sometimes the only source of comfort. It's always my instinct. I always feel like when someone's going through something terrible, I cannot fix this. Can I bring you dinner? Like, and the dinner's not going to be a filet mignon. It's, you know what I'm saying? It's, I just want to nourish you. And that instinct of nourishing
Comfort.
others. And I understand it was a restaurant. It wasn't, a charity, but it's kind of interesting on a spiritual sense that you went from that to turning around and then nourishing others.
I'd never really considered that connection in that way, but yeah, it's I'll have to ponder that. Thank you for that sort of insight.
There's another book.
Yes, it is.
So tell us about the book that you just wrote.
So the one that I just wrote is called The Foreigner's Confession. Surprise, surprise, Confessions in the Word, in the title. It's my husband is from what is now Serbia, and he learned about and did some writing about a celebrity from the capital of Belgrade from the 50s. This really interesting woman who inspired novels written about her, and she became involved with, married, and had children with a Cambodian royal. So one of the princes, and this is all in real life. And because he knew my background with Cambodia, we always just sort of speculated, what happened to her, because they don't know. She went back to Cambodia during the 70s and disappeared. She and her children disappeared. So I took that sort of real thing and sort of opened that up and speculated that she became a prisoner at this prison where I had done my research. So her point of view is one of two main point of views, and it is her actual, well, not her real, but in my book, her real confession that she is writing to explain her commitment to wanting to using communism to make the world better, and how she and the other, communists of that time got it so very wrong, and what that, an exploration of that, of putting heart into, we as Americans, we generally don't think of communism as necessarily a good thing, quote unquote. So exploring that. So that's one sort of timeline perspective set in 1977. And then the American woman protagonist is set in 1993, when the United Nations went to Cambodia to ensure free and fair, so-called free and fair elections. And that's the era when I lived there. And so, though this character is not based on me, I actually wrote myself in as the director, but as a secondary character. But the main protagonist is this American woman who has had this horrific car accident that kills her husband, her unborn child, and leaves her with an amputation. And so this woman goes to Cambodia to help landmine victims. And whilst there, she sees a painting of this Yugoslav woman. And there's this weird sort of time overlapping where why does she look like this Western woman who was tortured and killed in a Cambodian Khmer Rouge interrogation center in the 70s, and here she is in the 90s, and what's going on? And so their lives twist and intertwine. And it actually ends, it's a happy story, even though none of that was happy. But happy is subjective, right?
I cannot wait to read this. A dual timeline historical fiction is my absolute sweet spot when it comes to reading. Tell me about your reading life. How did you become so interested in, and I usually ask people how they become readers, but for you, you're interested in words in so many different iterations with your songwriting and your lyric writing.
Well, as far as reading, I mean, I have a marvelous memory of being maybe, we traveled around a lot, and I was always the weird girl. And so libraries and librarians were my safe place. And I will never forget sitting on the floor and crying. And I must have been the second grade or third grade. And this librarian woman handing me the mixed up files of Mrs.
Badgley, Frankweiler.
Yes. And so that was my first sort of memory of a book that sort of stayed with me, even though I can't remember how to pronounce it. So thank you for that. So that was arguably the beginning. As far as wordsmithing, I think, other than what I've told you, I remember my first sitting down to write historical fiction based on the life of Joan of Arc. And I have probably 20 books written by everybody about Joan of Arc. I mean, from the 1800s up until contemporary times. And so I researched, I read it all, I started doing the research, and I remember sitting down to begin to write it. And this was pre-computer, so I'm writing by hand. And then I went blind with the onset of multiple sclerosis. So I couldn't do it. So that stopped that. But then I recovered, and though all of us, who experience multiple sclerosis, it's all every day is a new day.
Whether they read a book a day or a book a year, I love asking people to tell me about their favorite books. And that includes you, dear listener. What's your all-time favorite? Your desert island classic? What about the childhood favorite that you still know by heart? The mystery that took you by surprise? The biography that changed your way of thinking? Or the book club favorite that you can't stop thinking about? I'm looking for guests from all walks of life to talk to me about all kinds of books here on the show. Go to my website, juliewroteabook.com, and click on the button that says, Be a Guest on the Best Book Ever. I'm really looking forward to talking to you. Now, back to the show. How did you come across this book that we're talking about today, Hunters in the Dark by Lawrence Osborne?
I love libraries, and I think I was just searching on my local library's search engine for books set in Southeast Asia or books set in Cambodia, because I was at that time writing this book set in Cambodia. And I think that his name came up. So Hunters in the Dark was written in 2015. He has a book that came out in either 2019 or 2020 that is also set, that's not set in Cambodia, but it's set in Bangkok. And so I think I read that one first. But Hunters in the Dark really appealed to me because it is set in Cambodia. And so much of the imagery was so familiar to, my personal experience. So I could really plop right down and, slap at the mosquitoes and pat away the sweat and all of that.
It's funny that you just said that, because this is one of those books that I'll be going about my day and I'll think, oh yeah, I was in Cambodia. I remember that time. And then I have to stop and go, Julie, you have not been to Cambodia. You just read a really descriptive book about it, but it has that effect. It's a very physical sensation.
It's an immersion. Mm-hmm. It's an immersion to read that book. isn't that what is so magic about fiction?
It is magic. Can you tell my listeners what this book is about, Hunters in the Dark?
Well, super briefly, it's set in it's not historic, and it's not exactly contemporary, but close. A lot of people know Cambodia because of the Pol Pot, horror, and the proximity of Cambodia to Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and so this doesn't have that geopolitical sort of backdrop that many books set in the region often have. This is a story of a young man who lives a very he's British. He's a school teacher. He has a really sort of dreary life, but he's not at all ambitious or wanting to change anything in particular other than the location of where he's at. So he ends up almost by mistake in Cambodia, and he basically gets caught up with the wrong people. and on the way, on that journey of being caught up with the wrong people, he discovers, he's one of them. And so we go on this journey, which is just like floating down the muddy Mekong River with all these sort of currents and meanders and everything. So what I like about Osborne as a writer is he really, you have to surrender a little bit to his writing at the beginning, because it can seem a little bit just slow and almost frustrating, because it's like, what's the point? What's the plot? What's happening? Okay, so things are happening, but who cares, right? So why should I care about these characters? Maybe that's a better description. These characters are so flawed, and this particular character is so deeply human that it's almost painful to enter into his experience of his life. That said, once you sort of get past that, you are on this journey that is quite remarkable and quite astonishing. Where he ends up and what happens to him on the way. So he starts in one part of Cambodia and ends up in Phnom Penh, the capital, and he meets a Cambodian woman, and he meets a corrupt police officer, and he's threatened, and bad things happen to them, but he sort of moves through that with this kind of like this sort of lazy river, sort of like, oh well, what will happen? So even though it's horrible, I found it a little bit kind of like amusing, but in a strange way. But
I know exactly what you mean. So I saw it compared to The Talented Mr. Ripley, which by coincidence I reread this year. And it reminded me a lot of that. These are objectively terrible people, most of them. And yet you can't help but be a little bit amused by what the hell are you all doing?
Yes.
And the other part of that is I felt very off balance through the entire thing, because I had no idea who to trust. And I started thinking that I guess that is something I always look for in a book, is you're with the main character and you're trying to figure out who you can rely on and knowing who you can't. And in this one, by the end of it, I did not trust a soul. I was convinced everyone was after him and that Robert was after everyone else.
and you know what? That's what I like. So all of the fiction and nonfiction that I've read about from this author, Lawrence Osborne, that's a theme. And I believe that is so honest and so human and smart. I think he's an intelligent writer. I would love to sit and have a drink with him or have a meal and just like talk about stuff. He's just one of those people that are not consumed with the everyday trends and fads and I would love to talk politics with him. I would love to talk, big issues with him. He has all of his books have been optioned for movies. He's suddenly become big. So he's been around for a long time. And now suddenly people have discovered him.
I had never heard of him before you recommended this book. And it was really fun to go on a deep dive of his work in the past week, because he almost seems like he's from another age, like this sort of Hemingway-esque manly man, hard drinking, traveling everywhere.
He wrote a travelogue book, traveling through Muslim countries, where to find a drink in a Muslim country.
It's called The Wet and the Dry, I think.
Yes.
Or The Dry and the Wet, something
Dry
like
and the
that.
Wet. Yeah. So a guy of, handmade shoes and tailored linen suits and he has been compared to Graham Greene from, a different generation. I don't know that I would say exactly that, but they're definitely, he was influenced by that era. And the pictures of him, what few there are, he's definitely a really, really interesting, like you say, man's man, kind of handsome, big guy. Why he lives in Bangkok? Well, a lot of those guys do end up living in Bangkok, whether, he's married or anything, I don't know. But anyway.
Unlike someone like Hemingway, he doesn't seem like, or his characters, I should say, don't barrel into a country, cause destruction, think everybody there is dumb, and then leave. The white characters who are in Cambodia are harmed by their lack of knowledge and suffer for what they don't know and what they don't respect.
Yes, and he respects the cultures. I think that's the difference of what you're talking about right now. Hemingway going, up Mount Kilimanjaro, to hunt or whatever. But that was a different era, right?
Yes.
So I think that we're all more global now, or many of us are, or should be. And I think that he reflects that in his writing.
One of the really sort of sinister aspects of the book is what a small place Cambodia is. And there are several times that happen to the main character, Robert
Greaves,
which is a
perfect
great
name,
yes.
Right?
But in the opening scenes of the book, he wins quite a bit of money
gambling,
and everybody he meets along his trip sort of knows this.
Yes,
and you get this very claustrophobic sense of everybody knows everything about this foreigner. And I wanted to ask, was that your sense? Because I looked it up and I read that there are 16 million people in Cambodia. So it can't possibly be true. What was your sense of that when you lived there?
Oh, personally living there? Well, mind you, it was 30 years ago. And so yes, everybody knew all of them, everything that I did.
All 16 million of them.
Yes. Well, there were only, maybe 7 or 8 million then.
Okay.
I mean, so there's been this in Cambodia, this huge, population explosion after the Civil War. I think that for the purposes of Osborne's books, he uses that and expands on it and amplifies it for exactly the purpose that you mentioned, which is this claustrophobic sort of oppression. So he creates this thick tapestry of physical environment, but the physical environment reflects the interiority of his characters, and there is this claustrophobia for sure.
As I was reading this, I was realizing I have absolutely no knowledge of Cambodian authors. Can you recommend some, or any Southeast Asian authors?
Shadow of the Banyan Tree. But that would be a really good one. That is set during the Khmer Rouge time, but it's written by a woman, and from her perspective, and is really very powerful.
Shadow of the Banyan. That is Vadi Ratner?
Yes.
This looks lovely.
That's a marvelous. And again, it's kind of I hope that more and more writers from the region will start writing, books about their lives independent of the war. But, we can't begin to understand the trauma that region experienced, in the 70s, 80s, into 90s, actually. And arguably, the United States was the perpetuator of much of that trauma. But that's another story.
What are you reading right now?
Right now, I am reading The Other Black Girl by Zakia Dahlia Harris. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And it's a story about a young woman, set contemporary, and she is working in a publishing house, a literary agency in New York. And she is the only person of color in the agency, and sort of it's what her life is like. And I'm kind of halfway through it. It's almost like a coming of age story in a way. So I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, because I know it will, because she's setting it up for something sort of ominous to happen. And let's face it, ominous really drives plot.
You read both fiction and nonfiction?
I read mainly fiction. I like imagination. Yeah. And nonfiction has to be really well written, like Lawrence Osborne's Dry and Wet.
Will you share with my listeners where they can find you and your work online?
Well, the book that I just finished is almost published. It should be available through the normal networks in February, late February. It will be available for ebook pre-order, maybe while they're hearing this now. I don't know. Remains to be seen.
We will link to it in the show notes, listeners.
Thank you. But I encourage people to go to my website, which is lyabadgley.com, and check out me, and feel free to request a newsletter. They come out quarterly, so it's not a spammy type thing. And I have an Instagram account and an author Facebook page. So.
This has been a delight chatting with you, and I hope you will come back anytime you have a book you want to talk to me about. I would love to hear what you're reading.
Thank you, Julie. This has been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening, bookworms. For more information on this episode and links to all the books we discussed, go to our website, bestbookeverpodcast.com. You can also follow the podcast on Instagram at bestbookeverpodcast. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and you can find me everywhere as Julie Wrote a Book. If you loved this episode as much as I loved making it, why not leave a review wherever you're listening? Each review helps new listeners find my work, and I'm so grateful for your help. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you at the library.